In the quiet shadows of World War II, far from the famed beaches of Normandy or the black sands of Iwo Jima, lies the forgotten island of Peleliu, a place where fire met flesh, and where ordinary men performed extraordinary acts of courage. This speech takes you beyond the headlines of history into the soul of one of the war's most brutal and overlooked battles. More than a clash of armies, the Battle of Peleliu became a crucible of endurance, sacrifice, and spiritual confrontation. Through this journey, we uncover not only the cost of freedom, but the timeless lessons it offers to a world still caught in unseen battles of its own. The Battle of Peleliu, though often overshadowed by more famous conflicts like Normandy or Iwo Jima, was in many ways a hidden furnace of fire, a place where the invisible weight of war descended with full force. It was not just a battlefield, but a crucible, a searing test of endurance and sacrifice. Unlike the grand spectacles of major invasions, Peleliu unfolded away from the world's eyes, quiet and forgotten. But within that quiet, something profound took place, something that speaks deeply to the cost of liberty and the invisible price of every inch of ground won in war. It began on September 15, 1944, when U.S. Marines landed on a stretch of coral reef surrounding a small island in the Palau chain. The objective, according to military planners, was simple: seize the airfield and secure the island to protect the flank of General MacArthur's operations in the Philippines. They expected it would take just 3 to 4 days. It would take over 2 months, but what was not seen on the surface was the inferno waiting to be unleashed. The conditions were almost unbearable. The sun scorched the island to temperatures beyond 110 degrees Fahrenheit, and the white coral sand reflected the heat like a mirror. Water was scarce, and what little could be found was often contaminated. Marines trudged forward with parched throats, blistered skin, and gear weighed down by exhaustion. Their enemy Japanese troops were deeply entrenched, not in surface bunkers, but in a vast system of caves and tunnels, fortified with steel and concrete, and designed to cause maximum attrition. The Japanese strategy had changed. No longer would they throw themselves in suicidal charges. They would bleed the Americans slowly from the shadows, from the caves, from the rocks. Every foot of ground became a battlefield, every ridge a place of death. The terrain itself was like something from another world: sharp coral cliffs, deep crevices, ridges that twisted like broken bones. It was as if the island had become a living creature, resisting every step of advance. But the real battle was not only physical. It was spiritual. It was psychological. In the fire of Peleliu, men were not only tested in body, but in spirit. They watched their friends fall. They crawled over ground littered with the dead. They survived days of endless gunfire, mortar shells, and the constant threat of hidden snipers. And through it all, they kept going, not for glory, not for recognition, but because of something deeper, a sense of duty, a bond with their brothers in arms, and a commitment that refused to break, even when their bodies did. The suffering on Peleliu was immense. Over 10,000 Japanese defenders were virtually annihilated, fighting to the last man. Over 1,800 Americans were killed, with more than 800 wounded. The 1st Marine Division, battle-hardened though it was, emerged shattered. Some units had suffered 70% casualties, and for what? That question would echo in the years that followed. Many later questioned whether the island had any real strategic value, whether the price had been worth it. But even if the maps said otherwise, the truth of the sacrifice remains. not all battles are measured by terrain gained. Some are measured by what they reveal about courage, about suffering, about the human spirit. Peleliu was a furnace because it burned away illusion. It stripped war of its romance. It revealed its raw reality, and in that place the ordinary became extraordinary. Soldiers became more than fighters. They became witnesses to the limits of human endurance. Their actions, though largely unseen by the public, became etched in the history of honor. To speak of Peleliu is to honor the unseen. It is to acknowledge that some of the greatest sacrifices in history happen not before cameras or in the pages of textbooks, but in places where no one is watching, where no fame is guaranteed, where only the heart can carry a man forward. That is why the battle, though forgotten by many, remains a furnace of fire, a symbol of hidden sacrifice and the high, often invisible cost of freedom. The Battle of Peleliu was not just a clash of armies or a struggle for control of a tiny Pacific island. It was a profound collision of worldviews, cultures, and spiritual forces that mirrored ancient patterns found in history, prophecy, and the human soul. At first glance, it was a military engagement, part of a grand campaign to reclaim the Pacific. But beneath the surface, something deeper was unfolding. The island became a place where two radically different ideologies met in brutal confrontation: imperial domination versus individual liberty, honor bound to death versus duty born of freedom, and a world you that embraced death as a tool of glory versus one that sought life even in the face of death. The terrain of Peleliu became a prophetic shadow, an altar upon which men were tested, and the values of civilizations were brought to judgment. The Japanese defenders were not merely soldiers obeying orders. Many of them believed in a warrior code that had its roots in the ancient code of Bushido. This was not just a military code, but a spiritual and cultural system that taught self, sacrifice to the point of death, absolute loyalty to one's emperor, and the belief that surrender was shameful. The caves and bunkers they built into Peleliu's ridges were not just tactical positions. They were tombs, deliberately constructed to become final resting places. They intended to die there, and they did. Their strategy was not to win, but to inflict such psychological and physical trauma on the Americans that their advance might be delayed or their morale broken. The American forces, by contrast, were fighting not for an emperor or a godlike figure, but for the principles of a republic: liberty, survival, duty, and the eventual hope of returning home. Their courage was not born from the pursuit of death, but from the struggle to preserve life. Yet on that island, those two world views collided. The Japanese would rather die than surrender. The Americans would rather fight to live, but were forced to step into death's shadow over and over again to complete the mission. It was as if the island became more than an island. It became a stage where ancient spiritual dynamics played out. The defenders vanished into the rocks, as if they were part of the island itself, rising up like shadows from the underworld. They struck and disappeared. They endured bombardments that would have shattered most armies, and then emerged from smoke and ruin, as if death had no hold on them. They became phantoms in the ridges, pressing the Americans into a form of warfare that was not just physical but psychological, even existential. For the American soldiers, each step forward was not just a maneuver. It was a confrontation with a kind of spiritual resistance. They were not simply taking territory. They were facing a force that had embraced death so fully, it blurred the lines between strategy and sacrifice. The Marines and soldiers of the 1st Marine Division and the 81st Infantry were forced to fight day after day under blistering heat, with little water and almost no rest, against an enemy that did not relent. It pushed them into places of internal reckoning, testing not only their strength, but their beliefs, their will, and the depth of their resolve. This prophetic pattern is not new. Throughout history, battles have emerged that seem to embody more than geopolitics. They become parables in motion, lessons carved in blood. Peleliu was one of those places. It was a foreshadowing of spiritual warfare, where human values were drawn into contrast. It forced men to choose despair or endurance, vengeance or mercy, collapse or courage. Those who fought there, regardless of uniform, entered into something larger than themselves. They became actors in a drama that echoed ancient truths, that every generation must wrestle with darkness, that freedom always comes at a cost, and that the line between good and evil is often drawn not in policy, but in sacrifice. Even the environment of Peleliu seemed to reflect this deeper reality. The land itself resisted. The coral was sharp and cut through boots and flesh. The ridges and caves formed a maze of confusion and entrapment. Nature joined the struggle, pressing down on both sides. The very air seemed to boil, and every advance came with a price. Yet in that crucible something was being revealed, that true strength is not the absence of struggle, but the decision to keep moving forward in the midst of it. The prophetic nature of Peleliu lies in its hiddenness. It was not lauded in parades. It was not captured in iconic photographs. Its strategic value would later be questioned, but this only adds to the mystery and meaning of the battle. Sometimes the most powerful lessons are learned in the shadows. Sometimes the most important fights are the ones no one sees. And sometimes the greatest victories are not the ones that make headlines, but the ones that test the soul and prove the heart. Peleliu, in this way, becomes a mirror to every generation. It speaks of the unseen battles we all face, the quiet moments of crisis that define our character. It reminds us that courage is not born in ease, but in the fire, that endurance is not shaped by applause, but by affliction, and that every act of faithfulness, even when unnoticed, carries eternal weight. In the end, Peleliu was not just a battlefield, it was a revelation of what men are capable of enduring, what they are willing to give, and what lies beneath the surface of every struggle. It was a prophetic island, calling out to those who would listen not just to remember the past, but to be ready for the battles of their own time. The Battle of Peleliu stands as a haunting reminder that not all battles are understood in the moment, and some of the deepest sacrifices made by men in war are seeds planted in silence, only to be understood, if ever, by the slow revelation of history. At the time, Peleliu was believed to be of crucial strategic value. It was intended to secure the eastern flank for General MacArthur's return to the Philippines and to neutralize the airfield that could threaten future operations. The planners expected a swift and decisive operation. Yet, what unfolded was a prolonged and brutal struggle that cost thousands of lives and raised a question that still lingers today. Was it necessary? As the months passed and the tide of war continued to shift in favor of the Allies, the importance of Peleliu seemed to fade. Other islands were bypassed, new strategies emerged. The airfield that cost so many lives was never used as initially intended. It is in this post-battle ambiguity that the deeper meaning of Peleliu begins to reveal itself. The island may not have changed the course of the war in a measurable, strategic sense, but it became a prophetic symbol, a foretaste of the inner and national struggles that would come long after. The last shot was fired. For many veterans, the battle did not end when they left the island. They carried it with them, in their memories, in their bodies, in their souls. Peleliu had wounded them in ways that no medal or commendation could fully acknowledge. The heat, the filth, the shock of close combat, and the trauma of seeing friends fall again and again left scars deeper than any physical injury. These were not men who returned home to victory parades or ticker tape. They returned often in silence, carrying questions that had no answers. Why were we sent there? Was it worth it? Could it have been avoided? These questions echo the broader reality that not every sacrifice yields immediate or visible fruit. In many ways, Peleliu foreshadowed the emotional and psychological battles that would emerge in the post-war world, when soldiers returned home but struggled to return to peace. The physical war ended, but for many, the internal war continued. Their pain was largely invisible to the public, their memories buried like the caves they had once fought through. And yet, their endurance became a silent legacy, teaching future generations that not all wounds bleed and not all battles are fought with bullets. The prophetic element of Peleliu lies in its mystery. It calls us to recognize that meaning is not always obvious and purpose is not always immediate. Sometimes what seems like a mistake in strategy becomes a masterclass in courage. Sometimes what history forgets, heaven remembers. Peleliu teaches that significance is not always tied to outcome. It is often found in obedience to the mission, even when the mission seems unclear. This truth resonates far beyond the battlefield. It speaks to anyone who has ever labored in vain, fought for something only to see it questioned, or suffered without recognition. Peleliu becomes a metaphor for every human struggle that appears fruitless at first glance, but in truth, no act of faithfulness is wasted. No drop of blood spilled for the sake of others is in vain. The men of Peleliu may not have known why they had to suffer so much for so little ground. But they went anyway. They gave everything, and in doing so, they testified to a principle far greater than strategy, the willingness to endure when meaning is not clear. In this way, the battle stands as a foreshadowing of not only post-war trauma, but also the broader challenges faced by nations and individuals after conflict ends. It reflects the reality that victory is not always the end of the story. After the battles, there is rebuilding. There is mourning, there is reflection, and often there is confusion. The world may celebrate triumph, but the soul still seeks peace. Peleliu whispers this truth, that war may end on the battlefield, but it continues in the human heart until healing is found. Looking back now, with the benefit of hindsight, historians still debate the necessity of the operation. But perhaps the true value of Peleliu is not found in maps or documents, but in the resilience it revealed. The island exposed the cost of obedience without clarity, and the power of endurance under fire. It showed the strength of the human will, and the quiet, prophetic weight of sacrifice that goes unseen. Those who fought there did not die in vain. Even if the mission's worth was questioned, the faithfulness of the men who carried it out cannot be. They became symbols of a deeper truth, that there are times when we are called to step into struggle, even when the outcome is uncertain, even when the reasons are unclear, and that in doing so we become part of a story far greater than ourselves. Peleliu, then, is not just a footnote in history. It is a testament, a shadow of future struggles, a call to remember that the greatest acts of courage often happen in places the world forgets. And the deepest sacrifices are sometimes understood only by those who make them. The island of Peleliu, though small and remote, became sacred ground consecrated not by ceremony or tradition, but by the blood, sweat, and ultimate sacrifice of those who fought and fell upon its brutal terrain. It was not a cathedral, not a shrine, not a monument built by human hands, but it became holy because of what took place there. Every grain of sand, every shard of coral, every ridge and cave was marked by the footsteps and final breaths of soldiers who gave everything they had for a cause they were told mattered. Even if the reasons faded with time, in that forgotten place, sacrifice was not abstract. It was visible, immediate, and constant. The men who landed on Peleliu in September 1944 did not come seeking glory. Many were veterans of earlier Pacific campaigns, Guadalcanal, Cape Gloucester, Bougainville, and they knew what awaited them. Yet what they found on Peleliu was unlike anything they had faced before. The terrain was an alien world of jagged coral, oppressive heat, and fortified death traps. The Japanese defenders had transformed the island into a maze of tunnels and bunkers, refusing the traditional suicidal charges and instead embracing a war of attrition, determined to fight to the last man. The result was a battlefield soaked in agony, where survival itself became a miracle. And yet, in the midst of that suffering, something sacred emerged. Again and again, men risked their lives to save others. They crawled into enemy fire to drag wounded comrades back to safety. They shielded fellow soldiers with their own bodies. They pushed forward when logic said to retreat, driven not by orders, but by love for the man beside them. These were not isolated moments. They were daily realities. Sacrifice was not the exception on Peleliu. It was the rhythm of survival. Many of these acts of valor were never recorded. Some were never witnessed, but they happened. Again and again, lives were laid down for others. Not because of ideology or patriotism alone, but because of something deeper, honor, loyalty, and an unspoken bond that forms only in the crucible of war. The battlefield became an altar where men poured out their strength, their hope, and eventually their lives, not because they wanted to die, but because they could not let others do so alone. The landscape itself bore witness. The hills, like Bloody Nose Ridge, became names etched in memory, not for their height or beauty, but for the cost of their conquest. Men bled for every inch. Days of shelling and fire turned once lush terrain into a charred graveyard. And yet, it was in those ashes that the sacred weight of the battle took root. Every fallen Marine or soldier turned that island into a place that could never again be ordinary. It was not just a location. It was a memorial written in blood. To walk through Peleliu now is to step onto hallowed ground. Though time has softened its scars and nature has begun to reclaim what was once scorched, the spiritual echo remains. You can almost hear the silence speak. The trees stand like sentinels over hidden graves. The wind moves through the ridges like a whisper from the past. It is as though the island itself remembers what took place there, even if the world forgets. But sacred ground does not demand applause. It does not advertise itself. It exists quietly, profoundly, and powerfully. Peleliu is that kind of place. The world may debate the battle's value. Historians may question its necessity, but none can deny the sacrifice that transformed the island into something eternal. The men who died there were not consumed in vain. Their lives became the seeds of something larger, a testimony of courage, of endurance, of the human spirit under fire. There is something deeply moving about this truth, that a place becomes sacred not by what it offers, but by what it receives. Peleliu received the last breath of sons, the cries of the wounded, the final prayers of the dying. It received the weight of decisions no man should have to make, and the silence of bravery that needed no witness. It became a silent sanctuary of ultimate devotion. And what makes such ground sacred is not only the suffering, but the willingness. These were not men dragged to slaughter. They chose to go. They knew the risks. Many wrote letters home before they landed, some sensing they might never return. And yet they moved forward. They advanced into heat and gunfire, into smoke and confusion, into caves where death waited in silence. And they did it not because they wanted to die, but because they knew someone had to stand. That is why Peleliu must be remembered, not just as a battle, but as a testimony. A place where human flesh met eternal purpose, where lives were not lost, but given, where the ground, though soaked in death, became alive with meaning. It is the kind of sacredness that calls us not to mourn endlessly, but to live differently, to recognize the cost behind peace, the price of our freedom, and the invisible weight carried by those who stood in our place. The sacred ground of Peleliu reminds us that greatness is not found in the absence of pain, but in the response to it. That true courage is not loud, but steady, and that sacrifice, when made in love and duty, becomes a kind of offering that no war can erase. Even if the world forgets the names, even if textbooks leave out the details, the island remembers. Heaven remembers, and we must remember, not only with our minds, but with our hearts and with the way we live. Because sacred ground demands not just memory, but honor. The Battle of Peleliu offers more than a chapter in military history. It presents a mirror for our own time, a reflection of deeper truths hidden in the past and urgently relevant in the present. In an age that values ease, comfort, and quick results, the story of Peleliu stands as a solemn challenge. It calls out across the decades, reminding us of what it means to endure, to fight for something greater than ourselves, and to give even when there is no guarantee of reward or recognition. It is not just a record of pain and loss. It is a teacher speaking in the language of fire, sacrifice, and perseverance. The men who fought at Peleliu endured conditions few can imagine today. They faced relentless heat, dehydration, fatigue, and a hidden, entrenched enemy that refused to surrender. The battle pushed them beyond physical limits into emotional and spiritual exhaustion. Every day they rose again, even when they were broken, even when their friends had fallen, even when the purpose of it all seemed unclear. They fought not because they saw the finish line, but because they refused to abandon the mission. That is a lesson modern comfort has nearly erased the idea of enduring, not for reward, but because it is right. We live in a culture increasingly averse to struggle. Difficulty is often seen as failure. Inconvenience is treated as injustice. But Peleliu tells a different story. It reminds us that some of the greatest victories are born through hardship, that strength is not always seen in what we gain, but in what we are willing to give up. On that island, men gave their strength, their peace, their health, and for many, their very lives. And they gave it all for others, for those beside them, for those back home, and for a future they might never see. Peleliu also teaches that endurance is not glamorous. It is not performed on stages or praised in the moment. It is the quiet decision to keep going when everything in you screams to stop. It is moving forward in the dark, with no promise of recognition. Those Marines and soldiers were not fighting for headlines or medals. They were fighting because they understood that liberty, brotherhood, and duty are worth every ounce of strength. And that kind of resolve is what our generation must reclaim, not just in war, but in life. We may not face bullets and explosions, but we face other battles, battles for truth, for integrity, for courage in the face of opposition. The spirit of Peleliu urges us to stand firm when the pressure mounts, to keep our commitments when quitting would be easier, and to serve others even when the cost is high. It speaks to marriages that require forgiveness, to careers that demand perseverance, to faith that must be held even when tested. It reminds us that the easy road rarely leads to anything worth having. The lessons from Peleliu are not only about sacrifice, they are also about unseen value. Many questioned whether the battle should have happened at all. Some said it was unnecessary. Others pointed out its minimal strategic impact. But for the men who fought there, the value was not in policy, but in the person beside them. It was in the willingness to go where they were sent and to fulfill the task, even if the world never fully understood. That speaks directly to a society obsessed with visible outcomes. Sometimes the most meaningful actions are the ones that don't go viral, the ones done in faithfulness, in obscurity, in private obedience. Peleliu also reveals a sobering truth. Freedom is costly. Every comfort we enjoy today rests upon sacrifices made in places most people have never heard of. We speak freely, live safely, and move without fear because someone paid the price in a place like Peleliu. And that realization should move us not just to gratitude, but to responsibility. What will we do with the freedom they gave us? Will we use it to serve others, to stand for truth, to pursue righteousness, or will we squander it in pursuit of ease? That is why the legacy of Peleliu must be more than history. It must be transformation. It must shape the way we live. Because what they did in those ridges and trenches was more than survival. It was a declaration that even in the face of despair, a man can rise. Even when death surrounds him, he can move forward. Even when the world forgets, heaven does not. We live in a time when values are shifting, when conviction is mocked, and when sacrifice is rare. But Peleliu stands as a prophetic reminder. We are capable of far more than we realize. We are made to endure. We are called to live for something greater than ourselves. The fire they walked through was not just a trial, it was a forge. It shaped men, it shaped history, and it still shapes us if we let it. The lessons from that island call us to remember, but also to act, to honor their sacrifice not just with words, but with lives of purpose, to carry forward their spirit not only in memorials, but in the way we love, serve, fight, and endure today. Because though the Battle of Peleliu has ended, the need for courage, conviction, and sacrifice has not. It lives on, in our families, in our communities, in every place where truth must be upheld, and light must stand against darkness.